Today I'm joined by Camelia Dewan. Camelia is an environmental anthropologist focusing on anthropology of development and the author of Misreading the Bengal Delta, Climate Change, Development and Livelihoods in Coastal Bangladesh. Dr. Dewan holds a Master in Development Studies and a PhD in Social Anthropology and Environment from the University of London. As a postdoctoral research fellow at the Department of Social Anthropology at the University of Oslo since 2008, she has examined the socio-environmental effects of shipbreaking in Bangladesh and is now an associate, senior lecturer, and assistant professor at the Department of Cultural Anthropology at Uppsala University. Thank you very much for joining me, Camelia.
Thank you, Xavier, for this invitation. I'm really excited to be part of this podcast.
Great. So, to start off, your role is an environmental anthropologist, which to me sounds exhilarating. Anthropology is something that I've heard about and I've spoken to anthropologists before, but environmental anthropologists seems like an extra niche of an extra level of excitement. So what does it mean to be an anthropologist to you? What does it mean to be an environmental anthropologist? And how does this discipline help us understand the world compared to other disciplines?
That's a great question. And I actually started off with a political science background and development studies, and I felt that there was an increasing focus and push towards quantitative research. And as I was working in development, I felt more and more of a pull towards doing qualitative research. I enjoy the complexity that qualitative research enables us to have. And especially with anthropology as a discipline, I've really been attracted to how it encourages the ability to think critically, to criticize, deconstruct, and unpack things such as climate adaptation, development, green economy, sustainability. And especially anthropology in the past few decades has really also focused on knowledge production and to understand how knowledge is produced. So the field in itself is increasingly or has been shaped by theories like Michel Foucault, for instance, on power and knowledge. And to be an anthropologist is to understand knowledge production by immersing yourself in people's everyday life in a particular society or group or a social setting. And ideally, it constitutes of informal conversations built on relations over time. Best part of being an anthropologist was actually doing my PhD fieldwork, the 1 year of fieldwork I did that my book is based on, to get to know people's everyday lives and concerns according to their own vocabulary, language, and priorities. And since I have worked in development before, I found that type of an approach, having 1 year to figure out things based on what people themselves say is quite different from, the ins and outs of development research, where you do focus group discussions and interviews, where the questions have to be quite compact and you only have limited time. So thus the questions themselves are formulated based on preconceived ideas and assumptions. So the anthropological method of participant observation is trying to get to people's lived experiences as best as we can. But also it involves recognizing our own biases, the focus on positionality and reflexivity of who we are shape what people share with us and how we may interpret what they say. I think it's also important for qualitative research and social science debates.
There's a really good quote by the former, I think, health scientist Hans Rosling, and he says that if we use our intuitions all the time in every context, whether that's in a scientific context or even a social gathering context, right? And if your worldview is incorrect, that means the intuitions that you build will be systematically wrong. And so it sounds like getting to the lived experiences is one of those ways we can systematically correct any of those intuitions that we have that may be false, and also really challenging and deconstructing the underlying assumptions as well, because an assumption is very effective at making judgments, but at the same time it can be it's a fallible approach. And so it sounds like sounds like I'm sure your fieldwork would have produced a lot of interesting things, and I think that's a good segue to your fieldwork. So I read part of your book recently, the Misreading the Bengal Delta, about your 12-month fieldwork in Bangladesh, where you conducted research, you conducted interviews, and you went through archival research, etc. Uh, I would be really interested to know, what did your field study teach you about the current discourse of climate change in Bangladesh, and how did anthropology as a field help you where other fields may not have?
I think I want to start off with how I ended up doing a PhD on climate change, which was over a decade ago when I started. And a colleague of mine in Bangladesh said that whatever I want to do for my PhD research, add climate change to your title and you'll get funding. And I was initially interested in flood protection embankments and how they worsen siltation and waterlogging. And that was based on a huge qualitative a survey that we did throughout the coastal zone, looking at the operation and maintenance of sluice gates and embankments. And so these were really pressing concerns. Water bodies were dying, and people were really concerned that, the canals that they need for irrigation and for local fisheries are disappearing and silting up and so on. So when he said that, I thought, what happens then if I write a research proposal that framed this as climate change? Will I still get to the key environmental issues that I want to look at? And is this in itself a problem if climate change becomes a development buzzword, similarly to, poverty reduction and gender and so on? Because we also know that climatic changes are happening. We see huge environmental crises all around us in different contexts. And it's not just greenhouse gases either. So to have climate change as a buzzword, it's not the same implications as previously with development buzzwords, because we should be using that money to address key challenges in the environment and for local livelihoods. And a key thing that's quite different now when I speak to interlocutors in my field site versus when I did my field work in 2014 and 15 was that, right now it's very clear that the seasons are changing, and the precipitation is more irregular. It's heavier, and sometimes it might not come at all. Or the dry seasons are expanding, salinity is encroaching more. And those things weren't as evident almost 10 years ago. And when I was conducting fieldwork in Bangla, so I did my fieldwork myself and trying to do it in the local language. And actually, it's quite good to have minimal language abilities in the sense that you ask about what everything means. So it really helps with the deconstructing and unpacking things. But my friend suggested that, she said that villagers won't know what climate change is. It's not a Bangla word, it's a donor word. So you can ask them about what changes in the environment have you observed. So পরিবেশে কি পরিবর্তন হয়েছে? So পরিবর্তন is change, পরিবেশ is environment. And when I asked that broad question that didn't have to do with climate as such, people would talk about waterlogging and siltation from embankments that I mentioned, and also how salinity kills or damages the soils. And this is due to, opening the embankments during the dry season to bring in salt water to grow tiger prawns, brackish tiger prawns for exports. So this food isn't even used locally. It actually destroys local food availability. And benefits a few elites. And then another issue of environment that was also reoccurring was, how the introduction of high-yielding rice varieties and the use of agrochemicals like pesticides and synthetic nitrogen basically suck the life, the shakti out of the soil, and also this creates food without shakti, and this makes people sick. So those were like the key environmental issues I focused on. But then by doing a participant observation, there were so many things that didn't fit in a climate or adaptation framework. And that was, child marriage, domestic violence, dowry-related demands, huge issues of underemployment and people migrating because of costs for healthcare for their loved ones or education costs for their children. So the reasons of migration was so multifaceted as well. And people weren't victims. They actively chose whether they could or not. So what my field study taught me about the current discourse of climate change is that often it's preconceived by foreign actors or external actors, and it might not match lived experiences. And there's been a movement in recent years by the late Salimul Haq on locally led adaptation to push back against global north conceptions of how Bangladesh is affected by climate change, by Bangladesh saying this is what we want to do for locally led adaptation. And I think that should be the way forward. And we also see, or I saw great examples of bottom-up climate interventions with donors such as Japan and Brazil, with the World Food Program, where they designed the project such that local actors could actually sit together and discuss how they wanted to use climate adaptation money, and they used that to excavate silting up canals through rural employment schemes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very good way for us to jump into topics of agency, and I would say robbing people of the ability to have control over a situation, which climate change for many people, not only for those reserved in global South countries, but globally, when we talk about climate change, there's a huge feeling of the ability to enforce significant change is difficult. And so perhaps we shouldn't do anything at all, or I should do I should focus on doing small acts like recycling. But in terms of larger forces, I think this is generally a feeling that's experienced by many. And so, and especially countries like Bangladesh, that as a consequence of the natural ecological landscape that's present there, such that you outlined in your book about how the monsoon rains cause natural flooding, and that's often perceived as climate change making things worse, and perhaps it is. And like you mentioned, there are issues that it's causing, and at the same time, this global north NGO perspective of forcing or shoehorning policies into local environments that may not be conducive to the policies are not conducive to what is needed, right? So I think a question I'd be wondering is, you write about Bangladesh often being portrayed as a victim in with regards to ecological crisis and environmental issues, and that's not just what the perception is. The IPCC also ranks Bangladesh as one of the most vulnerable countries. But what is wrong with these current portrayals, and why is this significant to the overall discourse on climate change?
Of course, climatic changes are happening, and I'm not denying that
Mm,
Bangladesh will be affected by it, but the discourse of Bangladesh as a climate change victim, it kind of bestows passivity, so that Bangladesh becomes a victim without agency. And that the issue I have with this is this narrative that global warming is inevitable, in a sense that it causes this kind of psychological effect, as you're saying, that, oh, but it's inevitable. What can I do? It's going to happen anyways. And if that type of a discourse and approach, it risks ignoring a long history of colonial and neo-colonial interventions that have damaged the wetland ecology of what is the Bengal Delta, like flood protection embankments, and how they pose a greater risk of coastal flooding than predicted sea level rise. And this is a bit difficult to explain over a podcast without visuals. But with the monsoon rains, you mentioned that I've done archival research. And that's something I started off with already in 2012, 2013. looking at these older maps and the colonial archives and how they mention embankments or bunds. And what was interesting then is if you go to the era of the East India Company and the maps of James Rennell and also a surveyor named Gastrell in the 1840s and 50s, they talk about monsoon rains, these bosha inundations as a blessing of fertility for Bengal. So during the East India Company, the monsoon rains were a blessing, and also the maps, they kind of showed that, these parts of the wetlands are they're wetlands this part of the year, and they kind of showed the dynamism and the changing nature of the delta. It's not just solid land all the time, but during the and what was happening then was the 1793 Permanent Settlement Act was this way of enclosing commons and creating private property in Bengal. And that meant taxing the new category of landowners, zamindars. So the people that cut down Sundarban mangroves and started reclaiming land, or wastelands as they called it, to grow rice, they didn't have to pay tax on those lands. So after that, you saw this acceleration of deforestation, and the border of arable lands going further south and closer to the Bay of Bengal. And that meant that during the dry season, the salt water would creep upwards and risk then turning these newly deforested arable lands, back into mangroves. So what did they do? They built something called bunds, these earthen bunds, and placed them at each inlet of the water bodies from the rivers to prevent salt water from coming in during the dry season. And then during the monsoon, they broke them down so that the entire rice fields would be inundated. So the river water mixed with monsoon water and irrigated the rice fields, and it was also fertile breeding ground for fish. So you see, the first bunds in this region, they weren't actually made to stop floods. They were broken to enable floods, and floods were not seen as bad. But when the British Crown took over and made the British Raj in 1856, this decentralized repair and maintenance of bunds during the East India Company was seen as too costly and cumbersome. And that's when you saw the shift to, floods as damaging to life and property, and the construction of watertight embankments that also kind of paved the way for the construction of road-based transport in Bengal. Because after the 1857 Indian Rebellion, or what has also been called the Mutiny, railways were seen as a way of quickly transporting soldiers to vast parts of the country. So embankments enabled railway construction and bridges and roads, and they had to be permanent. But by doing that, they stopped the monsoon inundation. And there's about 1 billion ton of silt. The numbers are shifting, but around 1 billion ton of silt that travel from the Himalayas throughout the Bengal Delta down to the Bay of Bengal. And the Bengal Delta or the country that is now Bangladesh, has been created through these silt deposits during the monsoon rain. So the silt builds the delta. So by depositing on wetlands, the silt deposits and raises land levels. But when you build these embankments, that silt ends up in the rivers and it raises riverbeds. So you end up with an elevation difference where the land outside the embankments is higher than the land inside. So during the monsoon rains, the monsoon gets trapped. It cannot flow outwards. And that is known as waterlogging and drainage congestion. And it's been a known problem since the watertight embankments of the 1800s. And already in 1920, all these census reports were talking about silting water bodies and deltas wherever they built embankments.
I can jump in there, I think, because to summarize, because I think there's a lot of interesting historical information tied in with analysis. So let me know if I've understood you correctly, but it seems that the there's a few things. There's the local environment, which in this case is is Bangladesh and the Delta. Then you have the local population. So the Bangladeshis at the time, people, I don't know when Bangladesh was formed. I think it was after 1950 sometime.
1771.
1771, did you say? Oh, okay. Well,
1971, sorry.
1971.
1971,
I was
sorry.
gonna say, wow, I'm 200 years off. That looks bad. 1971, right? So you have the local population that understand and have a shared history with the landscape, and then you have the external forces. You have people outside, people like the neighboring countries, but in this instance, we also have NGOs. We have global North countries, which enter the space and feel as though they understand the local ecology, and they bring with them their understanding from their environments, their local environments. Not and is a that is an intuition that makes sense. You know, if you come from a place where floods cause environmental destruction and you go to another place, I think it's a safe assumption to say, well, I think floods would be bad here too, but it completely ignores the ecological complexity of each local environment. And so it sounds like from what I'm hearing from you is that it's very important uh, when we're discussing, I mean, we can apply this to any country, but in this case, Bangladesh, it's very important to take into account the local ecological complexity and then the people in which inhabit those areas, and to stop imposing what outsiders think is best when the local population have shared a history with the place for years. Would you say that's a fair summary, or what would you correct there?
You jumped ahead a few decades, but I just want to like continue with that. And
Sure,
so
sure.
say that this is a longer history of embankments. And actually, what happened after partition in 1947 was that the zamindars that would coordinate Oshtomashi butts, which were these earthen bunds, so that practice continued in the coastal zone for a long time because the
Mm,
embankments didn't reach there. But when the zamindars that coordinated this maintenance of the temporary earthen bunds left for India, that was a vacuum. And in these reports at the time, you can see that the salinity came during the dry season and destroyed crops.
mm,
And also all the irrigation officials that were part of the British they'd also left. So there was a huge vacuum. And then what happened was you had all these foreign experts. You had the British, the Americans, UN coming in and saying, oh, let's just do this Dutch idea of polders throughout the coastal
mm,
zone of Bangladesh to stop floods. And that's kind of where this lack of local context happened because the Rhine Delta, the Dutch, they don't have that much silt in
mm,
their part of the world. And from the 1960s and 70s onwards, these are the embankments that I saw and that were known to have caused waterlogging and silting up, and a lot of canals and rivers basically disappearing. And this was well known in Bangladesh. So there was actually when Mitterrand wanted to do the flood action plan, and like because they were really distraught over all the waterlogging, which is when the water can't drain. And wanted to build more embankments. Bangladeshi civil society actually came together and protested and managed to stop that.
mm,
So what I find is interesting is with this climate change discourse, now you have the Netherlands and the World Bank casting the same flood protection infrastructure, the same ones as the ones built during the Cold War as climate adaptation infrastructure.
mm,
So that's why I also think we need to understand history because otherwise you end up um, basically reproducing past problems that cause ecological damage. Um, and this goes back to my point also about how flood protection embankments actually pose a greater risk of coastal flooding than predicted sea level rise, as a study by natural scientists in Vanderbilt have shown.
mm,
And so what I critique in my book is also, the idea of climate reductionism. That's Mike Hume's term, which means to attribute all change in environment and society to climate.
mm,
But the thing is, there are things to be done. Bangladesh will not simply drown. With all this silt, Bangladesh has an innate ability to actually
mm,
heighten these land levels, right?
mm,
If there's a way, figuring out a way of making sure that the silt can deposit and ensuring the water retention capacity of water bodies, that they don't silt up, but that they are maintained and widened and deepened to retain monsoon waters.
mm,
Um, and in that sense, Bangladeshis are not simply climate refugees. There are various other socioeconomic and political reasons for migration. Um,
mm,
so what I'm worried about is this climate change discourse is turning things into being inevitable so that business as usual risks continuing.
mm,
That we instead need to look at local and specific causes of environmental change and address their causes and tailor solutions that won't make ecological damages greater. So embankments, shrimp cultivation, and high-yielding rice, they're cast as climate adaptation solutions by different donors, but they're not climate solutions. Rather, they're what I argue climate reductive translations. And by translations, I mean like this practice of making things seem coherent to an outside audience. But they basically misread the Bengal Delta and continue with the same solutions they've done for decades, but say it's climate adaptation, and that won't solve the pressing challenges ahead.
mm. I love the term climate reductionism, especially in a political climate that I feel some people may feel nervous about uh, any any conversation that you talks about climate change and reductionism because of a history of climate denial or because of a history of donors and investors actively muddying the waters, so to speak, on what is a scientific consensus. But in the conversation of places like Bangladesh, I think your example is a very potent example of of people misreading the fundamental complexity of a local ecological landscape. And so, touching on from that and continuing on from that, um, you know, uh, why is the discussion of climate change? Why is the discussion of climate change, in particular, in regards to Bangladesh, why is it obfuscating? Why is it obfuscating uh, to say that, if we invest more in climate change aid, if we support the local communities with climate change focused projects, that's going to have a huge impact. Why is that obfuscating? You talked about, the definitions or the simplification of other topics like, uh, the salinity of the landscape. But, why is it obfuscating?
So in my earliest piece that took 5 years to come out, I write about embanking the Sundarbans, the obfuscating discourse of climate change. And I've kind of moved away from that through the notion of climate reductive translations because when I attended a workshop with Bangladeshi civil society members, and that was not donor related, it was a grassroots movement, and it was on World Rivers Day. One of them said, um, put climate change, gender, and poverty alleviation in your project application and you'll get funding, but will this help us save the river? And that I think is an interesting question to think with. Some people, like those on the World Food Program, use climate change as a spice. That was how it was used in my fieldwork, as a spice, to get funding for what they're able to do and what they thought the local environment, the local people needed to do. But at the same time, there are other actors who might use climate change as a spice based on doing what they've always wanted to do, that disregards local needs and disregards local ecology, like the embankment. It's based on this kind of uh, idea that, oh, but higher and wider embankments will protect Bangladesh from sea level rise, and then it just doesn't continue. And it's also a technical solution. They don't have to go into the politics and the cost of maintaining these infrastructures or dealing with the issue of siltation that actually donors have created through the Coastal Embankment Project in the 50s. And so I think the danger here is if we uncritically accept any intervention as climate related without asking, so how exactly? And this is what I did when people would pitch their project to me in English. I would ask them in Bangla, but how is this related to climate change? And a water and sanitation NGO worker said, to be honest with you, we just use it as a masala because we're a wash NGO and we need to do water and sanitation. And so this is our way of making sure that there's safe drinking water and latrines, you know. But then, so I find it difficult because it also means that there are a lot of other local concerns, like my entire chapter 5, that you cannot phrase in a way that can use climate change as a spice. So I think the danger is that you're imposing too much focus on climate change in ways that doesn't let bottom-up concerns get funding. And because even if there are what I call development assemblages, like that there are compositions of NGOs, government officials, and donors that might translate climate change as a spice in locally relevant ways, there are still a lot of things that need to be done or should be addressed that won't fit in through a climate change discourse.
Yeah. And so if I was to summarize that, Camelia, and maybe I'm extrapolating too much, but it seems like there's three things. The first thing why climate change can be obfuscating is that it can lead to people missing issues in terms of environmental issues. It can lead to people overlooking what's actually occurring because they have the lens of climate change on. And so you have a loss of complexity or nuance. The second thing is that maybe we have effective solutions that can resolve something, but those solutions are overlooked because we want to select the solution that is for climate change specific, that is funded for climate change purposes. And then lastly, and maybe this is what I'm getting from is that maybe it encourages bad actors, maybe it encourages NGOs who or external and people that are investing into Bangladesh. It, it encourages self-interest because people have a lot to gain from having investment in something. Whereas if you have climate change, like you said when you were doing your application and I think it was your professor said that, if you do climate change, you'll get funding. It encourages it encourages people to lean into it, even if it's not productive or it's inefficient or it is the wrong solution. Would you say that's a fair summary or?
No, I just want to add a little bit. Firstly, it wasn't my professor. He's a very critical
Oh,
anthropologist.
yes.
So,
Okay, very good.
but no, on the third one, I like your, categories. But on the third one, I also want to add, my colleague Jason Collins wrote also about how Bangladesh is increasingly seen as a climate laboratory. And I find that
Mm,
that is quite accurate because there are so many interventions that are being tested in the global south and countries like Bangladesh
mm,
to see if they can be applied everywhere else without any regard for like the local context. You have these
mm,
ideas about climate smart agriculture, climate smart housing, and climate smart whatever nots.
mm,
And that are just like when you go to the local area, it's like, what is this? And it doesn't have to be that people are bad actors. They actually want to save and help. So, but just because you want to save doesn't mean that
mm.
that's helpful. Like
It's
Gayatri
misguided.
Spivak said something about in terms of colonial issues about white men saving brown women from brown men. And there is some sort of
Mm,
saviorism going on
yeah.
that can lead to a lot of bad and unintended consequences.
Mm,
So that's why I also think that reflexivity is useful here because you're going into a country you have no clue about. Maybe you should read up and be, modest that you don't know much about the country. So maybe you should ask people And maybe,
Mm.
and I also, the thing is, when you go to Bangladesh, they obviously want you to spend your money there. So people are smart. They will say what you want to hear.
Yeah. Mm.
So I was very clear with that. I'm not a donor. I'm not bringing any project. I want to hear your concerns.
Mm.
And that's how, because if I'd come to them as a donor, they would just do the donor spiel to me,
Mm.
which I also write about. So I don't think it's necessarily bad actors. The shrimp actors, yes, definitely, my chapter 3. But other than that, I think a lot of people just want to do well and help. But like these climate smart agriculture things tend to be, high yield feeds, agrochemicals, uh, for instance, the climate smart housing are like these houses on stilts in these multi-generational village. People live with their elderly. And it's unclear to me how like the practical lives will happen. But these are so nice, fancy houses to like take pictures of and like show at conferences and like look at what we've
Mm.
done. And I think
Mm.
that can be problematic. I think people should be a bit more careful and self-aware when they go in with these ideas of helping climate victim countries.
Right. And so I think the essence of climate reductionism, or perhaps the research that you're doing in conjunction with climate reductionism, is that if the objective is to help people, and if the objective is to have a positive difference, not because it's in your interest to be a highly ethically perceived as a highly ethical person, or perceived as a highly um, impactful person in the field of climate change. If your goal is to really help, it requires that you be humble in the face of complexity, which I mean seems pretty obvious, uh, but I think it is a mistake that we all make in our personal lives, but even in the world of uh, in the world of development, in the world of trying to help people, which I think is a very important goal, and one that those speaking politically that are maybe left of center need to take into consideration. Perhaps people that are right of center, when they say, everything is, you can't say everything's climate change. That is, that's obscene. And then the left says, oh, well, you're denying climate change. There is a healthy middle ground that says, you know what? Maybe not everything's climate change. And at the same time, that doesn't mean that we should ignore the impacts of climate change. All it says is that we should be humble in the face of complexity. We should understand that impacts of climate change, as well as other ecological crises, are not univariate. They're not spread. They're not equally spread, and their impacts are not equally felt everywhere in the world. There's difference, there's diversity in impacts. Um, yeah. Do you have any thoughts on that? I'm tempted to keep going, but I
Yeah,
don't want
I think it's important because I actually wanted my book to be called Misreading Climate Change, but I wasn't allowed to because
to. Right.
the publisher was afraid that it would be seen as climate denial or
Mm.
something. And for me, that's interesting in and of itself because in my book, I'm very strong to say that climatic changes are happening because of capitalist practices. But capitalist practices have not only caused global warming and greenhouse gas emissions. I think that is also something that I want to expand on because I feel that maybe it's the business as usual people that have limited how we see or discuss climate change to, oh, but if we just do carbon trading and carbon offsets, but it's not only about carbon emissions in the air. That's not the only problem we have. We have a sixth extinction, uh, habitat loss, so many environmental problems caused by capitalist land use practices. And these embankments, they're also capitalist interventions. Shrimp cultivation for export, mega capitalist neo-colonial intervention. High yield agriculture, the green revolution in the global south. Same. These are capitalist interventions that have harmed the environment for decades, if not some of them centuries, or at least a century. So for me, it is a critique of capitalist interventions in the environment, um, and that we have to go beyond thinking about just carbon in
Mm.
the way in which the way we do economic development impacts the planet and local environments. And that I think kind of also gets obfuscated in the discourse of climate change because inherently we need to change the way we live and how we produce and how we
Mm,
consume. And if we don't do that soon, I don't know how this is going to end.
mm. Yeah, and I think the term that you're referring to, or at least I don't know if it's been formally defined, but there's something called carbon tunnel vision, on the scale of all the environmental problems that exist, whether that's biodiversity loss, whether that's, water crises, or that's eutrophication. There's all of these disparate environmental issues that are having such large impacts, and yet the focus globally, especially with speaking as a business student within the business world, is carbon emissions, net zero economy, green growth, making energy transition. None of these other environmental issues, which are can be just as catastrophic, are discussed. And perhaps it's because of the capitalist drive to you know to grow, and energy and all those other topics are huge drivers of investment, right? And so I think, to your point, very important that we focus on these other perhaps smaller scale, or maybe not smaller scale, but things that are often perceived as smaller scale issues. Um, and I think that comes back to environmental education in terms of uh, how do you shift the perception of something being important, and perhaps that is because of a capitalist mindset on the world where mm, environment is often relegated to the background. It is the background, and it's the cause of, that's where all of our waste goes in a metaphorical and in a physical sense. Do you have a sense of how we can navigate environmental problems more effectively? How do we talk about it more effectively or more usefully? And is there a way we can provide people with agency so they can feel that they have an impact, they can have an impact on the world? I mean, I know I've asked you three questions, so apologies, but take one as you
Uh,
like.
I'll start with I really liked the concept carbon tunnel vision. I've never heard of it before, so I'd be interested in reading more about it because I think it kind of gets to how this is also a techno fix when you're
Mm,
talking about like climate change is reduced to carbon emissions. And techno fixes, embankments are also techno fixes, they're always simplifying, oversimplifying, and they remove politics and the messy complexity.
mm,
Most of these actors, if you're in a business school, don't like messiness and complexity.
mm,
It just, and especially also with quantitative research, you want to have clear variables that you can do regression
mm,
analysis on. Um, and I think we need more qualitative research, that qualitative sciences and critical social sciences should be given a space at the table. And also in terms of how to do it, I get asked to review sometimes, and some of them are used assuming everything is climate. But then when you read through it, you see that, oh, but there are these environmental issues and these local things. So I think it's really critical to actually ask for the local context, the local environmental
mm,
causes. And when people say, oh, but climate change is causing this, so we need to do that, always unpack it.
mm.
What
Yeah.
exactly do you mean? And when you're saying Bangladeshi are climate migrants, what do you mean by that?
Mm, for sure. And when we start unpacking that local context and challenging the assumptions as an anthropologist, would you actually start to realize, actually, where does that assumption come from that flooding is actually a huge can be huge, very detrimental, or XYZ, right? Like the questioning of assumptions is pivotal. And I think an example that I think is quite interesting is in the Australian context. So Australia is an indigenous population, uh, arrived in Australia, I think 60,000 years ago. It's the oldest continuous living peoples in the entire world. It's not exactly clear how long ago they arrived, but something about 60,000 years ago. And when they arrived, uh, I think it was over a couple thousands of years, there was a change in the in Australia's ecology, namely that huge megafauna like they're called diprotodons. They're like these huge herb how do you say the word?
Herbivores?
Yeah, herbivores that would eat the landscape, the green landscape, and make sure that it was well kept. And these were hunted to extinction, or at least that's the dominant theory. And as a consequence of that, it led to large overgrowth, which then led to bushfires. And those bushfires then led to new trees, new biodiversity spawning, and changed the entire ecological landscape. But the people within the landscape, the indigenous community, learned how to then cultivate the landscape. And then since Australia has become a British colony and people have colonized it, in our management of the local environment has been, in some people's view, not as effectively managed because the local population, the local context, the people that understood and managed the land for almost thousands of years, their points of views were set aside. And so I think using that as another example here, when you if you if you ignore the local context and the people within that, you have a huge loss of knowledge, and then you start importing assumptions. Like we've imported all sorts of knowledge from the British into our local environments, which didn't work because Australia, as an ecological landscape, the soil is incredibly, it lacks so much nutrition that almost everything dies, which then spawns diversity, which is why Australia is one of the most diverse ecological landscapes. Anyways, I say all of this to say that I really love the ideas of your book, and I think everyone should go read the book and uh, use the term climate reductionism in a way that uh, not only sparks debate, because debate's good, but importantly challenges notions of political discourse. You know, we should be talking about things critically and not thinking in binaries. If you talk about this, you're X. If you talk about this, you're this party. You know, if you want to help people, you need to get to the nitty gritty. You have to challenge assumptions and talk about things, complex things. Anyways, I've just gone on a rant, but um, I would like to ask, is there anything you would like to contribute to that? And if not, then I have a final question for you.
Yeah, there are two things. One is, I think, also with the nitty-gritty and climate reductive translations, is to look at the actors, to actually also reflect on, okay, but what kind of project is this? Who's supporting it? What are their interests in the broader scheme of things? And how does that fit their narrative? To always look at the politics of knowledge production, because different NGOs, different government agencies, different donors, their priorities will differ. So some will want to increase exports of shrimp cultivation, for instance, for foreign exchange, to pay off loans. That is important to think about, as it's not just climate reductionism, but the translators, those that translate these climate reductive narratives. And then I also thought that this issue that you brought up with Indigenous communities in Australia is an important one, because it points to, these ideas of development as well. So in my book, I'm trying to also decolonize development. So it's more like I guess you can say, a political aim of the book, because I'm Swedish Bangladeshi. So my parents are from Bangladesh, but I'm born and raised in Sweden, but I studied in the UK. And so for me, I've always grown up to this Nordic idea of, the Nordics are the best, and then we're going
Hmm.
to help the rest of the world, especially poor countries like Bangladesh. So I've grown up to like always hearing that Bangladesh is poor and this and that, and it's always negative and inferior, right? And Bangladesh is now a middle income country and has done so much progress. It has a higher human development index than India. And it's a lot of things have changed in the past decades as well. Um, but what I felt was lacking is that we don't learn history. So when I teach my courses, I try to go back to colonial histories because there's this idea that the global south are poor because they're poor. The third world is just underdeveloped, and no talk about colonialism and what colonial interventions did in,
Mm,
destroying local institutions and ecologies and ways of life that are highly traumatizing. No one talks about the several famines or genocides, as one can also call them, occurring in Bengal since the 1790s. And, the World War II and Winston Churchill led to 3 million people dying in Bengal. And so I think it's also important to talk about, I think Farhana Sultana talks about climate colonialism, but for me, it's also interesting how colonial knowledge production is replicated and reproduced in climate knowledge production, and that we
mm,
need to be wary of not reproducing these ideas of development. Like Frederick Cooper, I write about it as well. He's a historian. He writes about modernity as a representation and a way of talking about the West as a model for the rest of the world to aspire, that discourse. And
mm,
how can we address environmental challenges when the model of the West is what's caused all the environmental problems to begin with?
mm,
I think we need to somehow move away from these ideas of constant growth, and decolonize development. And even like Marx is unhelpful because Marx only talked about the means of production, but he also believed in industries and industrialization. There's this entire downgrading of small scale agriculture.
mm,
But do we really need industrial meat farms, for instance, the way
mm,
we eat? Where I did my field work, the cows were so intelligent. They would go grazing in the evenings and come back home themselves. No one was hurting them.
mm,
And I didn't realize the cows were so intelligent because here we just have them in, these factory
mm,
farmings and confined spaces, and
mm,
that's also going to lead to zoonotic epidemics further on. So I just think that
mm,
the way we're consuming is inherently problematic, and we
mm,
need to think about what we mean by development.
mm. Absolutely. So if I was just to summarize what I would call some of the key concepts or key things to take away from your research, your thinking, and your book, the first thing is to go back to history to revise what your beliefs are, if they're only if the only history that you're familiar with is the history of post-colonialism. And the second thing would be to stop recycling stories. And when I say stories, I mean in a very broad sense, stories about what people and society is like in the global south versus the global north, how people feel about their lives versus in the global south versus the global north, etc. Right? Revising these stories. And the third thing would be to challenge your assumptions. And once you challenge your assumptions, then your stories about the world change, your stories about your life change. But most importantly, stories about uh, how we can help improve the world change as well, because you start realizing, hey, perhaps thinking about it only from one perspective is not not conducive to um, resolving highly complex issues. Would you say those would be the key, what some of the key takeaways, or would you like to add some more?
No, that was a refreshing and interesting take on takeaways. But I think we can go with them. So basically, yes, go back to history and local context, and the complexity and messiness of it all. To be wary of reproducing discourses of inferiority and difference, and to challenge your assumptions. Sounds about right.
Hmm, cool. Well, I think that wraps up everything then. A very, very last question, Camelia. In as few words or as many, what does your utopia look like?
That's such a depressing question right now. I feel from a historical perspective, we're going into very, very dark times, fascist
Mm.
times. I I don't know if I will see utopia during my lifetime. Sorry, that's not
But
a
if
cheery
you
answer.
could if you could construct one, right? If you could construct a utopia as you would like it, does that do you have a sense of what you would want in that hypothetical place?
In that hypothetical place, I would want a place of uh, Rawls's, veil of ignorance, where
Hmm.
whatever family you're born into, you can reach your
Mm.
best. Because there are too many class inequalities now. I would also want actual transparent and free democracy. So no turn towards right-wing fascism and their manipulation of propaganda and using social media to amplify anti-science voices. My utopia would go beyond Enlightenment ideas of binaries, nature, culture, um, male, woman, and accept that there is a lot of plurality in the world, and that the dichotomies themselves are the ones causing the problems, not people that are just being true to themselves, no matter who they love or what gender they feel they belong to. My utopia would see modes of production and consumption that were local, seasonal, and organic in line with local ecology and needs, meaning most people would be okay eating meat a few times a year, rather than having industrial meat farms to keep meat consumption low. But I also don't believe in pure veganism in the sense that we should have blood avocado from Latin America or grapes from water scarce region so even non-meat production can be extremely problematic. Also soybeans for vegan diets if it's from the Amazons. I mean, there are so many complexities, but in a utopia, all of these considerations wouldn't be dumped on consumers. They would be regulated
Yes.
by competent authorities. And these competent authorities would also be really fantastic at global environmental enforcement. So you wouldn't see the race to the bottom of dumping toxic stuff, and you wouldn't subject your population to constant and chronic pollution by manipulating what you say are thresholds, but you would actually make sure that everything is safe and clean things up. I don't know. I could go on and on and on forever.
Well, can I just say, I think that's a contender for one of the best responses I've gotten to that question. So I think we can leave it there. So thank you very much for joining me, Camelia. Stay with me in the virtual green room, if I can call it that. But if anyone wanted to look at your work or get in contact with you about some of research, regard your research, where can they find you, or where would you like to direct them?
So I should admit that my website, I don't know how to update it and I never do anything with it. So just email me on Camelia, Camelia Dewan, Dewan, at antro.uu.se. That's the Swedish spelling, so no H.
Great.
Thank
Well,
you.
thank you very much.
Thank you.